Hello and welcome to Pro Tips with Studio Pros. Today we're going to tackle the differences between samples and synthesizers. So what are samples and synthesizers? Well, in a modern context, we sometimes don't have the money, the time, or the facilities to go and record every single instrument that we need in our session. So we'll use something called a virtual instrument. Today we're going to talk about two different kinds of virtual instruments. We have samples and synthesizers. So a sampler will use real recordings of audio and then play them back as you request it, whereas synthesizers are actually generating the sound from scratch usually. So if that's still confusing, you can think about it this way. A sampler like Contact by Native Instruments will take actual recordings of things, for example, a recording of a piano playing middle C, and when you play middle C on your MIDI keyboard, it'll recall that audio file that was recorded anywhere in the world and play it back in your session. What they do to make this sound realistic, let's say a company like Native Instruments, for example, is they'll take a really great piano in a really great room, mic'd up really well, and they'll record every single note on the piano at different intensities and assign each one of those recordings to the appropriate note and velocity on a MIDI keyboard. For stuff like piano, this is amazing because for the most part, once you hit the note on a piano, it just rings out. So all they need to do is play these notes out, record however long they're going to record, and then as you're playing it, they just trigger each one of these notes. It ends up sounding pretty realistic, almost unrecognizable from the real thing. Where this can get kind of tricky are things that don't have a steady decay in their audio. So piano or drums or all kinds of sound effects are really well suited for a sampler. Where this starts to get tricky is things like strings or anything where the sound is sustained and has a legato feature to it. Takes some pretty clever engineering to make it sound real without recording every single possible combination of notes. Because of this massive library of sounds that is required to make samplers sound great, sometimes this comes at a compromise with your hard drive space and also your hard drive speed because the samples need to be able to be recalled in a timely manner. A synthesizer, instead of using actual recordings of instruments or sounds, will make the sounds from scratch. And that's why there's such a variety of synths available because there are a lot of different ways to create sound from scratch. Sometimes synthesizers are used to try to mimic real sounds. And just like a sampler, this is easier with things that have a steady decay and a very precise attack, but becomes more complicated when you have sounds that need to blend into one another. If you're familiar with that 80s sound, 80s music uses synthesizers a lot, not only in the actual keyboard synthesizers, but also stuff that's mimicking drum parts, even vocal stuff. So that can be kind of a guideline for you. Since synthesizers are creating the sound on the spot, sometimes it can be a little more heavy on your processor on your computer, but usually much, much lighter as far as how much hard drive space they take up. Some of them only take up a couple of megabytes. So let me show you a few examples of instruments played through samplers or through synthesizers. First one I'm going to show you here is a cello sample from LA Scoring Strings. I played them on keyboard earlier, and now we'll be able to listen. So that's the sample version of this. Let's hear what this synthesized version of a cello would sound like through a preset in Apple's Sculpture. No one's probably going to believe that that's a real cello, but you could see how maybe that would be more appropriate in a certain style of music than having the actual cello sample. For drums, things get really interesting because most of the drums you hear on the radio these days are not acoustic drums, they're synthesized drums. So here's a drum beat done with acoustic samples. Now here's the same exact beat done with a synthesized drum. You can tell they're two very different approaches when tackling how to make drums work in a song. With bass, it's similar. You can have a bass sample like this. Now that sounds like an actual bass player might have played that. If you're a real bass player, you probably would hear that sounds a little funny, but to the average listener, it sounds good enough. That same part done with a synthesized bass isn't really trying to mimic a real bass. It just wants to give you that low frequency floor that you want in a song. So there you have the difference between a string sound, the difference in the drum sound, and the difference in a bass sound when it comes to sampled versus synthesized. One more time to clear it all up, a sampler will take actual recordings of instruments that someone took somewhere in some studio and assign them to notes on your MIDI keyboard, whereas a synthesizer is generating the notes from scratch. So someone had to figure out what part of a sound makes what sound like what. I'll let the geniuses figure out how to make it sound good. I just want it to sound good when I play it on the keyboard. So hopefully that'll make sense to you the next time you're trying to pull up a virtual instrument in your session. Hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. And if there's anything you'd like for us to tackle, also let us know below. This has been Pro Tips with Studio Pros. Make music and have fun.